5 true scary stories of neighbor horror that will keep you up at night. What if the real horror isn't lurking in the dark forest or abandoned buildings, but just a few steps away, next door? Imagine the chilling thought. The people who wave at you from across the fence, exchange polite nods in the hallway, or share small talk by the mailbox could be hiding something far more sinister than you'd ever suspect. We tend to think of home as our sanctuary, a place of safety and comfort. But what happens when the line between refuge and terror blurs? What if the ones meant to be your quiet, inconspicuous neighbors are actually the architects of your nightmares? Neighbor horror taps into one of our deepest fears, the unease of not truly knowing who lives next door. In the ordinary rhythms of suburban neighborhoods, small town streets, and city apartment complexes, the terrifying can quietly bloom. Behind drawn curtains, locked doors, and smiling faces, there might be secrets so dark they seep into the lives around them, leaving trails of paranoia, unease, and sometimes blood. The following tales aren't simply stories crafted to scare. They're rooted in truths. Accounts whispered over campfires, written in police reports, and passed down as warnings to always be vigilant. These stories remind us that the scariest monsters aren't always found in fantastical realms, but often reside within the walls of our reality. These are stories of neighbors, the kind who redefine the word close. Their actions may start as mild oddities, easily dismissed as quirks, but gradually, their presence becomes a shadow that lingers too long, a knock that echoes too loud, and a gaze that cuts too deep. The horror unfolds not with a sudden scream, but with the slow, deliberate unraveling of what you once thought was normal. So, before you turn off the lights tonight, remember this. The real terror might not be found in what's out there. It might be right next door. Story 1. The House with the Flickering Lights. The cul-de-sac was picturesque, a suburban dream where lawns were perfectly trimmed. Children played under the watchful gaze of their parents, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. For Lisa and Mark, newlyweds eager to settle into their first home, it was exactly what they'd been searching for. They unpacked boxes, exchanged greetings with neighbors, and began building their idyllic life. It wasn't until their second week that they noticed something peculiar. At precisely 3 a.m. every night, the lights in the house directly across from theirs began to flicker. Not just a random flicker, but a rhythmic, deliberate pulse, as though signaling some hidden message. Lisa spotted it first. "Mark, do you see that?" she whispered one night, pulling back the curtain slightly as they lay awake in bed. "It's the same time every night." Mark shrugged, brushing it off. "Probably just old wiring. The house looks like it's been empty for years." But Lisa's unease only grew. Night after night, the flickering persisted. The house itself was a stark contrast to the lively neighborhood. Shutters hanging askew, weeds overtaking the yard, and a mailbox that had rusted shut. The neighbors avoided discussing it, brushing off questions with vague, uneasy comments. "That place," one elderly woman said, her voice low as if afraid to be overheard. "Been empty for ages. No one's lived there since, well, it's been a while. Best to just leave it alone." But leaving it alone wasn't something Lisa could do. Her curiosity seeped into their daily lives, filling conversations over dinner and quiet moments in the evening. Eventually, Mark gave in to her insistence and installed cameras facing the house. The first few nights yielded nothing unusual beyond the flickering lights. But on the 4th night, shadows appeared, faint at first, then more pronounced. They seemed to drift past the windows, their movements erratic and slow. "Someone's in there," Lisa whispered, gripping Mark's arm as they reviewed the footage. "I thought you said it was abandoned." "It is," Mark replied, his voice tight. "At least it's supposed to be." Their obsession deepened. Lisa began cataloging the flickering patterns, convinced it was some sort of code. Mark bought a pair of binoculars and spent hours peering through them, trying to catch a glimpse of who or what was inside. Then came the breaking point. One night, as the lights flickered their strange rhythm, the shadows moved again, but this time they weren't confined to the house. On the camera feed, a shadow crossed the yard and stopped at their driveway. "It's watching us," Lisa breathed, her face pale. Mark couldn't sleep after that. "We need to know what's going on," he said, a mixture of determination and fear in his voice. Against Lisa's better judgment, they decided to investigate the house themselves. Under the cover of darkness, they crossed the street. The air was colder than it should have been, the kind of chill that seemed to settle into your bones. The front door creaked open, unlocked as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the faint scent of decay hanging in the shadows. The flickering light was more intense up close, its source coming from the basement. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. As they descended the basement stairs, the flickering light bathed the walls in an unnatural glow. At the bottom, they found him, an old man sitting in a rickety chair, his gaunt face illuminated by the strange light. He didn't move or acknowledge them, his eyes fixed on something behind them. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm guarding it, keeping it from getting out." Before they could ask what it was, a sound echoed from the shadows, a low, guttural growl that sent a wave of terror through them. The light flickered faster, almost strobing, as the shadows around them began to writhe. They turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut, sealing them inside. The old man didn't move, his gaze fixed forward as the shadows consumed the light. The next morning, the camera showed no signs of Lisa or Mark returning home. They had entered the house, but the footage offered no clue as to where they'd gone. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm. Except, of course, for the flickering lights. At precisely 3 a.m. every night, they continued their unrelenting pulse, as though calling for their next visitor. Story 2. The Whispering Wall. When Sarah first moved into the aging apartment complex, it felt like a fresh start. Life as a single mother wasn't easy, and the affordable rent offered her and her young son, Ethan, a chance to rebuild. The building was nothing fancy. Faded wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and a lingering musty smell. But it was a home, and that was all that mattered. For the first few weeks, life was uneventful. Sarah juggled her job at the diner and her responsibilities as a mother, often collapsing in a bed exhausted each night. Ethan, a lively 5-year-old, adapted quickly, filling their small space with his laughter and endless energy. But then the whispers began. It was subtle at first, a faint murmur coming through the bedroom wall. Sarah assumed it was her neighbor, probably on a late-night phone call. She paid it no mind, too tired to care. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until Sarah could make out words. "Sarah," the voice murmured. She sat up in bed, heart racing. Who was saying her name? She pressed her ear to the wall, trying to catch more, but the voice faded into silence. The next morning, she mentioned it to the building manager, an older man named Mr. Callahan. "Apartment next door?" he said, scratching his head. "That unit's been empty for months. No one's in there." Sarah frowned. "But I heard someone at night talking." Callahan shrugged. "Old building like this sounds scary funny. Could be coming from anywhere." That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were more insistent. They spoke not in conversations, but in fragments, personal details about Sarah's life. "Ethan misses his father. You cried in the kitchen last night. You're still wearing his ring." Sarah froze, her stomach twisting with dread. These were things no one else could possibly know. She tried to drown out the whispers by turning on the TV, but the voice persisted, cutting through the noise like a knife. By the 4th night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She marched to the supposedly vacant apartment, pounding on the door. "Whoever's in there, stop it," she shouted. "This isn't funny." Her voice echoed down the empty hallway, but no answer came. Fueled by frustration and fear, she returned to her own apartment, determined to prove she wasn't imagining things. That night, she set up her phone to record the sounds. The whispers began as usual, soft and taunting, but Sarah resisted the urge to listen live. She kept the recorder running until the whispers finally stopped sometime near dawn. When she played the recording back the next morning, the voice chilled her to the core. "Get out before it's too late," it hissed, the words sharp and clear. Her blood ran cold. The urgency in the voice wasn't just a warning, it was a command. Sarah called Mr. Callahan again, begging him to check the neighboring unit. "Something's going on in there," she insisted. "Please, just look." Reluctantly, he agreed. Later that day, he unlocked the apartment while Sarah hovered in the hallway. The door creaked open to reveal a dusty, empty space. No furniture, no signs of life, just silence. But something felt off. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the far wall, the one adjoining her bedroom. It looked different, almost warped, as though the drywall had been pushed outward from the other side. That night, Sarah slept with Ethan in her bed, too scared to leave him alone. She kept the lights on, but even they couldn't keep the whispers away. The next morning, Sarah awoke to an unnatural stillness. The air felt heavy, oppressive. She stepped into Ethan's room to check on him and froze. The wall was torn open. It wasn't just damaged, it had been shredded from the inside, jagged edges curling outward. Beyond it was not the neighboring apartment, but a gaping void, dark and endless. Sarah stumbled back, clutching Ethan close as she stared into the darkness. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. She packed their belongings in a frenzy, not stopping to explain her sudden departure to anyone. As she drove away, her heart pounding, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the reflection, she swore she saw the apartment building, her apartment, flickering, as though struggling to maintain its place in the real world. She never looked back. Story 3. The Vanishing Boy and the Watchful Neighbor. It started with a missing child. Billy Harper was 8 years old, last seen riding his red bike down the street at dusk. His disappearance sent shockwaves through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Flyers were taped to lampposts, search parties combed the nearby woods, and news crews swarmed the cul-de-sac. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, hope dimmed, and whispers of what might have happened began to fester. For Mia, a college student spending her summer break at home, the disappearance was unsettling but distant. She didn't know Billy or his family personally. They lived a few houses down, their paths never crossing. But something about the case gnawed at her, an unease she couldn't shake. Her unease deepened one evening as she watered her mother's garden. From her vantage point, she could see into the yard of her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, a reclusive man in his 60s who rarely left his house. Strewn across his unkempt lawn were toys, a small red truck, a baseball glove, and, most chillingly, a bike that looked eerily similar to the one described in the missing persons flyer. The sight froze her in place. Why would a man like Mr. Grayson, who lived alone and had no grandchildren, have those toys? That night, Mia mentioned it to her parents, but they waved it off. Mr. Grayson's strange, sure, her mother said, but he's harmless. Those toys could have been left there by someone else. Mia wasn't convinced. She began to watch Mr. Grayson's house more closely, her curiosity growing into an obsession. She noticed little things. How he never turned on the porch light, how his blinds stayed drawn even during the day, and how he frequently disappeared into his garage for hours. Her suspicions peaked one humid afternoon when she saw him carry a large black trash bag into the garage. The bag sagged in the middle, its contents heavy and oddly shaped. Mia couldn't let it go. She decided to investigate. That night, under the cover of darkness, she crept across the street to Mr. Grayson's yard. The toys were still there, scattered like forgotten relics. Her heart pounded as she approached the garage. The door was padlocked, but a side window had been left slightly ajar. With trembling hands, she pushed it open and climbed inside. The smell hit her first, a sour, musty odor that clung to the air. The garage was cluttered with boxes, tools, and old furniture. But what caught her eye were the photos pinned to a corkboard on the wall. They were pictures of children, dozens of them, their faces frozen in moments of laughter and play. Some looked decades old, their edges yellowed with age. But in the center was a photo of Billy, grinning as he held up a trophy. Next to the corkboard was a cassette player. Mia hesitated, then pressed play. The room filled with the sound of children's laughter, bright and joyful, but something about it felt wrong. The laughter didn't fade naturally. It cut off abruptly, replaced by a low hum, almost like static. A sudden noise snapped her out of her trance, a faint cry, muffled and distant. "Help, please!" The voice was weak, barely audible, but it was enough to send chills down her spine. It was coming from beneath the house. Mia scrambled out of the garage and around to the back of the house. There, she found a storm cellar, its door secured with a rusty chain. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers slick with sweat, until she finally pried it open. The cellar stairs descended into darkness, the air thick and damp. She called out, "Billy, are you there?" The cries grew louder, guiding her deeper into the shadows. She reached the bottom and found herself in a small, empty basement. No boy, no signs of life, just bare concrete walls and a cold, eerie silence. Panicked, she fled and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house thoroughly but found nothing. No fotos, no recordes, no toys. Mr. Grayson denied everything, insisting he had no idea what Mia was talking about. Without evidence, they had no choice but to let him go. Mia was devastated, her mind plagued by questions. Had she imagined it all? 3 days later, Billy reappeared. He was found wandering near a gas station miles away, disoriented but unharmed. When asked about his disappearance, he told a strange story. "The neighbor took me," he said, his voice trembling. But it wasn't Mr. Grayson. It was someone else, someone who doesn't live on our street. His description of the neighbor was vague, almost otherworldly, a tall figure with no distinct features, like a shadow brought to life. Mia's blood ran cold. She moved back to her college dorm early, unable to stay in the neighborhood any longer. As for Mr. Grayson's house, it remained quiet. The toys disappeared, the blinds stayed drawn, and the whispers of suspicion faded over time. But Mia knew better. Something was watching. Story 4. The Shadow on the Porch. For Martha and Henry Caldwell, retirement had been a long-awaited dream. Their quaint home at the edge of town, with its wraparound porch and sprawling garden, seemed a perfect setting for quiet evenings and gentle mornings. Life was serene until the shadow appeared. It started subtly. Martha first noticed it one night while washing dishes. The soft glow of the porch light revealed a shape on the rocking chair, unmoving yet unmistakably there. "Henry," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is someone on our porch?" Henry joined her at the window, his brow furrowed. The chair swayed ever so slightly, but as soon as he opened the door to check, the porch was empty. Only muddy footprints leading from the steps to the chair remained. "It's probably some teenager pulling a prank," Henry said, brushing it off. But Martha wasn't convinced. The next few nights, the shadow returned, always seated on the same chair, always vanishing when approached. Henry began to grow uneasy. They decided to install motion sensors and cameras around the property, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was responsible. At first, the motion sensors seemed to do their job. The floodlights would flare up, scaring away raccoons or stray cats. But the shadow, defying all logic, continued to appear undeterred. When Henry reviewed the camera footage, he found nothing but empty frames where the shadow should have been. Yet in the mornings, new footprints would be there, tracking dirt into the pristine porch. Then the thefts began. Small, seemingly inconsequential items disappeared from their home. A pair of Martha's reading glasses, Henry's old pocket knife, a photograph from their mantel. Days later, the items reappeared in strange places. The knife wedged into a porch railing, the glasses neatly folded on the rocking chair, the photo tucked into the garden soil. "This isn't a prank," Martha whispered one night as they sat in their living room, the curtains drawn tight. "Whatever this is, it's not normal." The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sent their hearts racing. Then came the night that would haunt them forever. They had left the porch lights on, determined to keep the shadow at bay. But as the clock struck midnight, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Martha peeked out through the curtains and gasped. The shadow was there, more defined than ever, edges sharp against the pale glow of the light. It didn't vanish this time. It moved. Henry joined her, and together they watched in silent horror as the shadow rose from the chair and turned toward the door. Slowly, deliberately, it approached, its form almost human but unnervingly wrong, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. The knocking began, soft at first but growing louder, each knock reverberating through the house. "Don't open it," Martha pleaded, clutching Henry's arm. "I wasn't planning to," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The knocking stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then a sound came from the porch, a low, guttural whisper, as if the shadow was trying to speak but lacked a voice. The couple didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, they found the porch in disarray. The rocking chair was overturned, the floorboard scratched, and the muddy footprints now trailed around the entire house. They called the police, but there was nothing anyone could do. No evidence of a break-in, no intruder caught on camera. Desperate to escape, Martha and Henry decided to sell the house and move closer to their daughter in another state. But their relief was short-lived. On their first night in the new home, Martha awoke to a familiar sound, the creak of a rocking chair. She bolted upright, her heart racing. Henry was already at the window, face pale. There, on their new porch, was the shadow. It didn't knock this time. It simply sat, swaying gently in the chair, as if to remind them that some things, no matter how far you run, will always find you. Story 5. The Letters from No One. The Martinez family had always been excited about their new home. A cozy colonial in a friendly suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect place to raise their two kids, Ellie and Mark. They were warmly welcomed by their neighbors, who brought over casseroles and potted plants, assuring them they'd made a great choice. A week later, the first letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope slipped under their front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing an ominous, handwritten message in spidery letters. "Stay inside after midnight." Maria, the mother, laughed nervously when she read it aloud to her husband, David. Neighborhood kids messing around, maybe? David agreed, brushing it off. He placed the letter in a drawer, determined not to let it ruin their excitement. But the letters didn't stop. Each day, a new envelope appeared. The warnings grew stranger and more specific. One read, "Your daughter hums while she colors. Keep her quiet after dark." Maria froze when she read that one, because Ellie did hum while coloring, something she only did in the privacy of the family room. How could anyone know that? Another letter arrived the following week. "Don't trust your neighbor, especially the one with the blue car." Maria and David exchanged uneasy glances. Their neighbor, Mr. Larson, parked his blue sedan in the driveway every evening. He seemed pleasant enough, a retired teacher who loved gardening. But now, Maria couldn't help but feel a chill every time she saw him tending to his hydrangeas. As weeks passed, the letters grew increasingly intrusive. They referenced family arguments, bedtime routines, even what they'd eaten for dinner. The sense of being watched was suffocating. The family stopped using their curtains, opting instead for heavy blackout blinds. David called the police, but with no tangible threats or evidence, there was little they could do. The letters, they said, were likely from a disturbed but harmless prankster. But the Martinez family didn't feel harmlessly pranked. They felt hunted. The tension in the house mounted. Maria snapped at David for leaving the back door unlocked, and the kids were forbidden from playing outside unsupervised. They began to suspect everyone, neighbors, delivery drivers, even the mailman. One evening, after another cryptic warning, midnight isn't safe. Ignore this at your peril. David decided he'd had enough. We're not going to let some nutcase control us. Let's have that dinner party we've been planning. Show the kids life is normal. Maria hesitated, but eventually agreed. The party was lively, with neighbors filling the house. Laughter and music drowned out their unease. By 11:45 p.m., the last guest had left, and the family was cleaning up when the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. "Probably a blown fuse," David said, trying to sound calm. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the breaker box. Maria stayed in the kitchen, clutching her phone, ready to call for help. Then Ellie screamed from the living room. Maria and David rushed in to find their daughter pointing at the window. In the dim moonlight, a figure stood outside, its outline barely visible. It was tall, still, and unnervingly close to the glass. David swung open the door and shone the flashlight, but the figure was gone. Only wet footprints remained on the porch, leading to the side of the house. The family huddled together in the living room, trembling. Maria insisted they leave immediately, but David argued they should wait until morning. At dawn, they ventured outside. On the porch, an envelope lay atop the muddy footprints. Inside, a new letter awaited. You should have left when you had the chance. The police arrived within the hour, investigating the previous night's events. They discovered something chilling. The footprints led to the backyard and vanished into a patch of overgrown grass where a trapdoor lay hidden. Beneath it was a narrow cellar filled with old belongings, photographs, clothing, and journals. The items belonged to a man named Daniel Reed, the house's previous owner, who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors claimed Reed was a recluse who often spoke of hearing voices and receiving letters before his disappearance. The final discovery made Maria's blood run cold. One of the journals contained descriptions of her family, their names, habits, and even the dinners they'd eaten, all written in Daniel Reed's handwriting. Who had sent the letters? Who or what was watching them? And was Daniel Reed truly gone? Or was he still somewhere, lurking? Unable to bear the uncertainty, the Martinez family packed their belongings and moved within days. But even in their new home, they couldn't escape the paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window brought back memories of the house. And one morning, a familiar white envelope appeared under their door. Inside, the message read, "Welcome home." Horror doesn't always wear a monstrous face, nor does it dwell in the shadowy corners of far-off places. Sometimes it's just next door, behind the neatly trimmed hedges and welcoming porch lights. The seemingly mundane masks secrets so dark they defy explanation. These stories, though terrifying in their own right, share a deeper thread. Our fear of the unknown and the unsettling realization that we might never truly know the people closest to us. Neighbors are supposed to be our allies, the ones who lend us sugar or bring in our mail when we're away. But what if they're not? What if there's something else entirely? Something unknowable, unthinkable? From the flickering lights to the whispering walls, from vanishing children to shadowy figures that refuse to disappear, the stories show how paranoia can creep into the most innocuous spaces. It starts small, a strange noise, a misplaced object, and grows into something insidious. The scariest part isn't the ghost or the shadow, but the uncertainty. Is it real? Or is it all in your head? These tales force us to confront a chilling question. How well do we really know the people living around us? A friendly wave, a polite nod, are they mere masks hiding darker truths? The more we think about it, the more we realize that the line between reality and imagination is razor thin. But there's one final story to tell, one that I've never shared before. Years ago, I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, much like the neighborhoods in these stories. My neighbors were friendly but distant, the kind of people who exchanged pleasantries without ever truly connecting. Across the street lived an older woman, Mrs. Delaney. She was reclusive but kind, always tending to her garden and leaving baskets of vegetables on everyone's doorstep. One day her deliveries stopped, her garden wilted, and the once bustling house grew eerily quiet. Concerned, I knocked on her door. There was no answer. The next morning, I saw a moving truck in her driveway. A man I'd never seen before loaded boxes into the truck. "Is Mrs. Delaney moving?" I asked. The man paused, staring at me like I'd said something strange. "Who?" "Mrs. Delaney. She lives here." He shook his head. "Nobody's lived here for years." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. "No, I've spoken to her. She leaves vegetables on my porch." The man gave me a puzzled look. "Lady, I'm the realtor. This house has been empty since the owner passed away 5 years ago. You must be mistaken." I didn't sleep that night. I tried to convince myself he was wrong, that Mrs. Delaney was real. But the more I thought about it, the more the details unraveled. Her face became harder to picture, her voice fainter in my memory. I went to the garden the next morning. It was overgrown, wild, as if it hadn't been tended to in years. And there, amidst the tangled weeds, I found something chilling, a basket of fresh vegetables, sitting neatly on the porch. That was the day I stopped asking questions. Sometimes, the only way to stay safe is to never look too closely. And as you finish reading this, take a moment to consider, when was the last time you truly looked at your neighbors? And are you sure you want to?